is likely to happen next. So this is a deeply significant moment. You will have heard in the bulletin that they've already started chucking out diplomats. That generally is par for the course. It means that Putin is rattled by noises coming from the West, and those noises chiefly are Keir Starmer and Joe Biden essentially approaching a position where Ukraine will be able to fire missiles into Russia, deep into Russia. I just want you to stop and think about that for a minute, because I don't want this conversation to be conducted in a gung-ho fashion. So Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Ukraine did not want to be invaded. Ukraine continues to resist furiously the attempted annexation by Vladimir Putin. Two factors possibly see Ukraine pursuing a different fate than Crimea, and that is A, the quality and strength of resistance, which was largely unexpected by the Kremlin, and B, the international cooperation, the international support. I mean, let's get the depressing stuff out of the way early, shall we? If Kyiv had fallen on day one, or day three, as Vladimir Putin thought it would, I think that Ukraine would probably be today like Crimea was 10 years ago. I don't think there would have been international outcry. I don't think the West would have funded or indeed armed an underground guerrilla resistance. I could be completely wrong. I'm not sure anybody can answer this question clearly. But history suggests that if Putin were able to present his conquering as a fait accompli, then the Western order, the NATO allies, would have sort of fallen into line behind it with objections and things. But I don't know. You think back to how Cameron handled Crimea, and you get back to me. But we're looking at a significant, Vladimir Putin himself describes it as a move that would change the very nature of the conflict, forcing Moscow to respond. He says that it would mean that NATO countries are at war with Russia. Technically, I don't know that that's true. But he said, we will take the appropriate decisions based on the threats that we will face. In a way, there are parallels to be drawn between Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu. They both need war to continue for very different reasons of self-preservation. Vladimir Putin, almost certainly considerably richer than Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, possibly combined, needs to stay in power in order to keep his money. And in order to stay in power, he needs to do two things. He needs to destabilize the West so that his own citizens don't do what citizens of Ukraine did a few years ago and look to the West and think, why the hell aren't we part of that world order instead of this mad old business? And the more unstable the West becomes, the less attractive that option becomes to the people of Russia. And the second thing he needs to do is ramp up nationalism, ramp up both nationalism and victim narratives, because they go hand in hand together. The whole world is against us. We are the best. We are the greatest. And you can't really do that without war. And, of course, controlling the media. So the situation in which Ukraine finds itself today is fairly straightforward. It is in a situation of almost constant attrition. Some periods of time go well for Ukraine. Some periods of time go less well. The huge imbalance in forces has, I think, surprised everybody in the sense of Ukraine's successful resistance, and indeed successful retaliation. The talks at the White House today, and I don't know how big a stake Keir Starmer really has in this. It was always Tony Blair's justification, wasn't it, for getting fully into bed with George W. Bush, was that it's better to be there. You can stay their hand sometimes. You can be a critical friend. Off the top of my head, I can't think of much that Tony Blair stopped George W. Bush from doing on that catastrophic Middle Eastern path that he led us down. So I don't know. I mean, it's a British newspaper. I'm British. I like to think that the British Prime Minister can sit in the Oval Office and somehow have enough agency to influence the decisions taken by the American president. But it seems a little bit unlikely to me. Nevertheless, we're in lockstep with what American policy will be. So Keir Starmer and President Biden today will talk about letting Ukraine use British-made Storm Shadow missiles against targets in Russia. I don't think you need to be Columbo to know that this is almost certainly going to happen. The tone and the content of the coverage is crystal clear. They've spent weeks accusing Moscow of a significant escalation. They've taken 200 ballistic missiles from Iran, reportedly, for use against Ukraine. And the question that many people struggled with from the beginning, which is why Ukraine can't attack Russia, now moves into very, very sharp focus. So I've stressed that I don't want the conversation to be gung-ho, but equally, I don't want you to feel excluded from this due to lack of knowledge, which is why I want to refer you, oddly, to a board game called Risk, which I used to play a bit as a kid, but not as much as some of my friends. And I never fully understood why it was so popular. But I do today, oddly. I understand its popularity today because its distillation of diplomacy, up to and including war, is almost perfect. It hinges upon one thing. I'm going to use the word rapacious again, and indeed untrammeled. It hinges upon the notion that regimes have a rapacious and untrammeled desire to expand. Now, that's no longer true. It was true for huge periods of human history, but it's no longer true. It's the process by which 150,000 Englishmen could enjoy dominion over 300 million Indians just 100 years ago. It's a rapacious and untrammeled desire to expand. Now, the UK doesn't have that anymore. And even if it did, there wouldn't be a great deal we could do about it. France doesn't have that anymore. Portugal doesn't have. The great powers of old largely don't have it anymore. China kind of has it, but only with one or two relatively small targets, and its expansion is more commercial than militaristic. It doesn't need to conquer countries in Africa because it has essentially bought them through what is usually called roads and bridges or bridges and roads. You end up investing in so much infrastructure in these countries that they can be in a form of hock to you forever. But Russia is different, I think. Russia does belong to that ancient tradition of rapacious and untrammeled annexation with an extra dimension of very specific history, which is, of course, the idea that the breakup of the old Soviet Union was an insult to Vladimir Putin's manhood. It was actually an emasculation of a nation that is felt keenly by individuals, that whole program of breaking up Mother Russia, breaking up the Soviet Union was an appalling betrayal of the communist tradition, or a betrayal of the imperial ambition, or a betrayal of the sacrifices even of the Second World War. But I don't think that matters much to Vladimir Putin. I think that is a stick that he uses to beat or to whip his supporters into a frenzy while also using it to beat his enemies. He needs war to stay in power. He needs to stay in power to keep his money, which means the prospect of peace in Ukraine, it's Belt and Road, forgive me, not Bridge and Road. It means the prospect of peace in Ukraine in the context of a Russian withdrawal is very, very slim. Russia need to be beaten. Russia cannot really be negotiated with to peace unless they are permitted to keep huge swathes of territory which is not rightfully theirs, in the way that happened in Crimea. And that's why many people have struggled up to this point to understand why Volodymyr Zelensky can order incursions into Russian territory and has done so with some success recently, but he can't shoot missiles at Russia while Russia shoots missiles at him. I'll say that again. I'll make sure I've got my teeth in. They can't shoot missiles into Russia, even as Russia shoots enormous amounts of missiles into Ukraine. And how can that possibly be right? Answer, because if you shoot missiles into Russia, in other words, if you do to Putin what Putin is doing to you, then international diplomacy kicks in, and everybody who has helped Zelensky do this, up to and including the country in which the missiles were made, i.e. good old UK, become part of Putin's coalition of enemies. or rather the coalition of Putin's enemies. So the idea of poking the bear because the bear will respond explains why it has taken months, years of war and carnage and killing to reach this point. But there it is. I mean, none of that changes the fact that Putin is essentially a bloodthirsty dictator. Whatever the reasons for his addiction to annexation and imperial expansion, the addiction is the point. The addiction is the problem. And when the president of Russia says on state television that it would mean NATO countries are at war with Russia, it doesn't really matter whether he's technically correct or not. All that matters is that's what he believes, or at least that's what he will tell the Russian people, and that when he speaks of the appropriate decisions will be taken based on the threats that we will face, well, it opens up all manner of possible avenues, doesn't it? Russia started this conflict, Keir Starmer said on his way to Washington. Russia illegally invaded Ukraine, Keir Starmer said on his way to Washington. Russia can end this conflict straight away. Ukraine has the right to self-defense, and obviously we've been absolutely fully supportive of Ukraine's right to self-defense, providing training capabilities. But we don't seek any conflict with Russia. That's not our intention in the slightest. But they started this conflict, and Ukraine's got a right to self-defense. Slightly disingenuous, because there comes a point where the distinction between self-defense as the resistance of people attacking you on your own turf is different from self-defense in the context of you firing missiles into their turf. But I think it holds. It's clearly self-defense. Ukraine does not have any ambitions to annex part of what is currently Russia, which puts the UK and the US firmly in the middle of the question of what happens next. So my view, and I'm far from an expert, as you've probably gathered, although I'm a little more clued up on some of these factors than I would have been a few years ago. My view is that you can't really negotiate peace with an authoritarian dictator. But unless you can beat him, unless you're confident you can beat him, firing missiles into his territory is an incredibly risky thing to do. If I were Keir Starmer, I'd be tempted to do it. I think I probably would do it, and I think he is going to do it. But none of us know what that really means, which is the point at which it's probably worth having a conversation. What does this story mean to you? What do you think? Should Keir Starmer and Joe Biden agree today, as they are expected to do, that UK-made Storm Shadow missiles will be fired at targets in Russia, on sovereign Russian soil, by Ukrainian troops, by Ukrainian soldiers? And whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea, a necessary act or an unnecessary act, what will it mean? What will it do? What happens next?